Hello everybody, welcome to the Gaea portion of this course. I'll be breaking down how I created this mountain, which is obviously in the same style as we discussed last time with these references. I'll be going through it from start to finish. I will not be recreating this, I will be simply going through the nodes. The reason is because I can be a bit more concise this way, and it's also not a situation of the blind leading the blind. In Gaea, a lot of the time, you kind of have to guess at what's going on. And even though I have a workflow for this, it's still quite finicky, and certain parameters can be, you can easily miss them. And I don't really want to have to constantly be referencing this. So it's quicker for me, it's quicker for you, and I can focus on the actual content without being burdened by having to recreate something that I've already created. So that's how this is going to work. Hopefully you guys are going to be fine with that. I think it'll be good. Real quick, in every other portion of this course, you can get away with free stuff. You can use the Houdini Apprentice version for free and export .obj files, which is all you'll really need. Although Alembics with the paid version, they are nice. They're a bit more compact and easier to import into Blender. But Gaea, there is really no free alternative, so I'll be providing the 4K version of this mountain, which is exactly what you see here, for free. You can pick it up in the description. I don't want you to use that as an excuse to skip out on this video. There's a lot of useful stuff in here. The 8K version will be on my Patreon. More info in the description. Let's get started. So the first thing I did was I did what I call a slope study. I won't be going over this node for node because we'll be doing that with the actual mountain. But the basic premise is that I use this slope noise, which is Gaea's sort of testing noise. It creates a slope for you to test your erosion and stuff on. I put it through a number of shaper nodes to create something that looks roughly like this. And then I refine that with terraces, erosion, and various other things, and then a very quick job of coloring it. It's very important to use a sort of progressive refining method with Gaea. If you do something like you use an erosion, it can easily get sort of overwritten by a node like a displace if you're looking for the details that the erosion provides. But if you're using it in this sense, which is as a shaper node, so for instance, I take this rivers, which gives us these channels and such. I run it through an erosion and then a thermal shaper. And what this does, this gives me a very rigid look. And I like that because it sort of follows what I want the terrain to look like. Like as we saw in our references, if I open PureRef, this is very rigid. It's like flowy and stuff, but it's still rocky at the same time. So I'm creating that, and then I'm displacing that so that I can refine it with more details. And I still have stuff to work on because working on a smooth terrain isn't very exciting for the computer or for you or really for anybody. Let's move on to the actual mountain, and I'll cover that more node for node. I'm not going to cover it slider for slider necessarily. You can read these, and I don't need to tell you all that, but I do think it's useful to sort of go through the thought process. I started this actually with just plugging in a mountain and seeing how that works. But I found out that this was like too steep and a little bit too rigid at the start. I didn't have much control over it, even though it was actually kind of a good base. So I decided to use Perlin and then a zero borders, which gave me this softer look. It's still a bit too steep, so I just combined it with an empty value, and that sort of lowers it down. This effects doesn't really do much, but it's there just to control so that nothing gets too high. This is a very soft base, so I'm displacing it a little bit with some like high-ish frequency noise. And that just gives me a lot more detail. Also, this, I go here, like this zero borders really softens that base. So this really kind of roughens it up a little bit, which is nice. Thermal, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Pretty much just really carving out all those details. I got a scale. This feature scale is sort of a general slider that controls the overall global power of it. A bit less precisely, but a bit more sort of intuitively than the strength. And then a rivers. Again, I don't actually want rivers in here per se, but this gives me very good channels and such. Like if I compare these, this is boring. This is a little bit more interesting. And it also really helps the erosion sort of find its footing. Can't really see it because this is a strong erosion, but it does make it so that the erosion sort of looks a little bit more erody. And again, this is a shaper node, right? Like this is giving me ridges and stuff. I don't actually care for these nice channels and flows and such right now because those are going to get overwritten by a displacement and then terraces and then all the other stuff. This thermal shaper really just sort of refines it into this nice rigid thing. You can also use something like a valley node, which will give you an interesting shape as well. That's going to be an exercise to the listener to figure out sort of how that works. And it's pretty cool. I want to give you guys some room to experiment, but I also want to give you enough info about my workflow here. Thermal shaper into the displays to really get all that detail back. You can see here, again, we preserve some of that rigidness while also giving us that general base shape and that control that we have with the thermal shaper, all that other stuff that went in before that. And if you're curious, you should be able to eyeball this, but it's just a very high frequency purlin that I'm displacing it by. And terracing it. These terraces are masked on the slope. The reason why is because if I didn't, it would look weird. And then another thing is this blur right here. This will soften this slope mask, because if it doesn't, it becomes spiky and weird because this slope mask is very sharp, as you can see. If you have little terrain bits poking out through here, like that becomes quite ugly. And it'll really screw with everything. So that's a good way to get your terraces to look rather convincing. And then there's also, you'll notice there's a gradient here for the terrace modulation. That's what's essentially making these terraces a bit slanty. In real life, they aren't really straight a lot of the time. And in our reference, they're a bit offset. As you can see, just they're sort of facing towards the camera, which is kind of interesting. So just a little bit of that helps. Like if you're looking up at it, that's sort of how it looks, right? Regardless, even if they didn't do that, I think this is a cool look. So I'm combining that. Well, I should actually go through here. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a thermal node, but I'm masking it on the snow mask for this snowfall node. What that's doing is it's making sure that since the snow mask will naturally not really fill up these really steep, like rigid, rocky bits, it basically ensures that I'm only eroding the bits that need to be eroded. And I'm still getting plenty of erosion there, which is nice. Most of these are preserved, but I am combining it back in with this fractal terraces node on its max setting. That way I just don't lose too much detail while still maintaining that erosion. This is still subject to change. I'm not entirely convinced that this is a better look than this. I think this is a very strong look too. So I might just play around with this. So just be warned that that might be a change in between episodes or in between lessons. So I'm still rather torn on that because I think this is quite cool as well. We will see. For the sake of this tutorial, I'll just be using what I've already set up. The reason why I'm doing this rivers, even though it doesn't really seem logical, is because this is very smooth, and in reality, the talus won't be that smooth. So let's look here. Look at how many like little goalies and stuff form. This is really easy to see. Like there's a lot of carving in there, and it's really cool. So to do that, we're using our favorite channel builder, which is the rivers. That's going to carve a lot of like these little channels into the sides of the mountain, into the talus, specifically from the thermal node. But because this looks kind of goofy, running it through an erosion node to really sort of blend that all in. And the nice thing about this erosion node is that if you use the thermal with these little rocks, which is given by this fine detail, by the way, the erosion will sort of pick up on that and it'll get a little bit roughened up, and you can see they're still poking through there. And then the surface node will actually accentuate all that, and it's really cool. The surface node, by the way, is being masked on the slope. It's meant to increase the roughness and detail of the cliffs, which are notoriously difficult to do in Gaea because it's height map based, so you have a lot less data to play with as opposed to like a flatter terrain. So this helps with giving the illusion of more detail. And the cliffs are the main reason we're going into Houdini, as well as just optimization. But we can really play around with these cliffs by using stuff like triplanar displacement, which I'm really interested and really excited to get to work with you guys on. So I still wasn't fully happy with how deep these channels were, so I used a breaker node to really accentuate them. And you can see this gives us a little bit, these really like little steep channels. Basically, it's carving into those already made channels. It's not super important, but it definitely does give the impression that they're deeper than they actually are, which is useful, and they'll catch the light and all that fun stuff. Then a little bit of snowfall and some quick colors to sort of match the color up to the reference, just so that I can get a good way of looking at it. Coloring stuff in Gaea isn't something I pay a lot of attention to. There are people like, I know it's part of some people's workflow, like I know Aaron Westwood does this, where he uses the color that he gets from Gaea to inform the texture on his mountains, but I don't personally do that. I've never really, I know it has its uses, but I prefer working in texturing just all in Blender and using the system like for previs. Anyways, outputs. We're outputting the height from this, and then we're combining in this RGB mix the flow maps. The reason why we're using an RGB mix and not just this output is because we can use different flow map levels at different channels, and we have more control as we can separate those. So for instance, let me just give you an example. We can use this flow map here to inform our snow distribution. And if we have it broken into 3 channels where we can access 3 different points of data, we can probably get something like the secondary or tertiary and isolate that and use that as our mask, which is definitely preferable to having all of this stuff being mashed together. That being said, it does come at the cost of a bit greater memory draw and definitely a little bit less elegant. Like for instance, if you just want a regular flow map and you want to combine all of these, you have to run it through like a vector math length thing or just add them all together. That being said, it's actually not that big of a deal. Anyways, that's one of our outputs. And then I am gathering these other 3, which are the snow mask, which is the red, the swale, which I've equalized here, and this slope. Why do we need the slope, you ask? Well, because this gives us a nice like smooth texture-based slope that we can use in Blender for texturing, or even in Houdini, although we can get this pretty easily. In Blender, we either have face normals or pixel normals, and pixel normals can be influenced by textures and stuff, and that's good for a lot of things. Like for instance, if we want rocks in our mountains and our cliffs and stuff, or textures, that makes it a lot easier to get fine detail and texture blending. But sometimes for stuff like snow that has built up a little bit, you don't really want all that, and it's useful to have this as a nice data point. We're just preserving the original values of the slope. Thank you for following with me on this brief overview of what I've done in Gaea. And in the next installment, we'll be reprocessing this in Houdini to not only give us better cliffs and stuff, but also make it a little bit more lightweight so that we can get a little bit more detail with a little bit less vertices. I'll see you all later.